Hello, Humanities 1302. Hope everybody's doing well. But anyways, welcome to another lecture here in class. And today the topic that we're going to be covering is that of the legacy of the Civil War. Now, really quickly, I do want to address one item really fast. There is going to be a little bit of overlap between this lecture as well as the Civil War memory lecture y'all will be watching this week. Now, with the Civil War memory lecture that talks about how Americans are going to remember the Civil War through literature and so forth, but anyways, the lecture video for that, it was recorded about, I want to say, what was that, 3 years ago? It was actually a lecture I delivered for the Lone Star College University Park campus. And so it wasn't initially intended to be for a humanities course. And so with that said, there are a lot of relevant topics, but you'll notice that A, the format's a little bit different, and then also B, that a lot of the topics that I'll be talking about in this video, some of which I do discuss in that video as well. But anyways, I just wanted to kind of give a kind of quick heads up just in case you're like, oh, you've already mentioned that. But anyways, with that said, let's go ahead and dive into today's topic, the legacy of the Civil War. Now, we're going to be focusing on several aspects of the legacy of the Civil War, and I'm going to try to keep this video relatively short. But anyways, we're going to really be focusing on the military and social impacts of the Civil War, specifically how it's going to impact, we'll talk about Civil War veterans a little bit later on, but also how both regions of the nations are going to attempt to recover from this conflict. And as we'll see, especially with the military impacts of the war, they will be very heavily seen on one side, especially in the American South. But anyways, we're going to discuss even though how this period came to an end and maybe issues might have been resolved because of the war, each side is going to have a different vision over what the post-war should look like. And as a result, we'll see that because of these differing visions, that sectional tension would remain for the foreseeable future. Now, for us, our chronological narrative, if you will, is going to really end with the Spanish American War, but you could really talk about the legacy and the impacts of the Civil War all the way up to this present date. But for the sake of simplicity, we're going to end with formal reconciliation by the Spanish American War. But anyways, let's go ahead and get started with our topic now that we have a brief introduction. First, I want to talk about the impacts on the war, specifically on the South, because it's important for us to recognize, and there's a fun statistic I always love to share in my History 1301 courses, that the Civil War was fought in over 10,000 different places, but the grand majority of these places are going to be fought in the American South. And so, really, the impact the war is going to have on the South, I mean, it's going to devastate the region, both militarily as well as financially. Now, if we take a look at the South's infrastructure, I mean, it really is going to be devastated as a result of the war. I mean, even to begin with, the railway system, probably the biggest thing we think of when we think of infrastructure in the South. Even during the war, it was very much in shambles, but more so after the war, especially as you see Sherman marching through the South, tying up railway lines, creating his famous Sherman's ties by really taking railway ties and wrapping them around trees, making them to where it couldn't be usable for the Confederate war effort. Not to mention the farmlands and the plantations that the various armies, not just Union armies, but also Confederate armies, marched over during the Civil War. They're going to be devastated as well. And the Southern economy truly doesn't recover from the effects of the war financially, at least for some time. Now, in regards to the cotton industry, that will be the most prevalent industry that we still see in the South after the war. Because of the outbreak of the conflict, cotton prices would never truly recover, and we'll see that the Southern economy, it'll take it really until the end of the century for it to at least show some semblance of recovery. However, poverty is still going to be widespread throughout much of the region. Now, a big reason to why we'll see cotton prices plummet and why the Southern economy is going to fare so poorly after the war, one will because of the military effects on plantations. But as you get into a decade, 2 decades after the conflict, it will be because of the Union blockade during the war, to where because of the Union blockade, nations like England, predominantly England, but also France to a lesser extent, begin to import their cotton from elsewhere than the American South. You'll start to see that they begin to ramp up efforts to import it from largely Egypt as well as India. And so now with competition, you can see why prices are going to plummet and why and why you will see poverty widespread across the South. Now, in regards to their continuing with their economic system, but also their social structure, it's going to be greatly changed as a result of the war. Remember, we talked very briefly about how the war led to emancipation. Well, you see, 4 million individuals are going to be freed from bondage. There's going to have to be a new labor force created in the American South if it's going to remain on this agricultural model. And while the Southern economy remains largely based on agriculture, you'll see sharecropping is going to emerge that will replace slave based labor. Now, sharecropping, it's going to be almost a serf-like system to where it's going to financially tie individuals to the land, prominently at first African Americans, but as we'll see over time, if you take U.S. history, it starts to transition over to being dominated by poor whites. But nonetheless, what we'd see is while some things will change in the South, many things won't change because it will keep the social hierarchy that we'd seen present before the South. Plantation owners would still have much of the wealth, even though some of them would be financially destroyed because of the war. And you would still see that there would be these rigid class kind of divides. And once again, African Americans, even though they're freed from bondage, as we'll talk about with the Jim Crow South, are going to continue to be looked down upon, continue to be racially oppressed. And we'll talk about that with the Jim Crow laws. So we see financially, militarily, economically, socially, how the war has major impacts on the American South. Now, as far as the North, I don't have this included in the lecture slides that are posted online, but socially and economically, the war will have tremendous impacts on the North, more so because the war is going to really help stimulate industrial growth. You'll still continue to see a transition carry in the North for individuals working as farmers, which is still the prominent profession for many Americans before the Civil War, to earning wages. They're not necessarily going to go to work in factories, but you will start to see them take a job in a factory, textile mill, or dockyards, and so on and so forth. So you do continue to see that trend take place because of the Civil War. And likewise, you'll see because of the impacts of the war, the Northern economy is going to fare a lot better than the Southern economy. And that's where much of the GDP growth there, as well as the West, is going to take place in the nation. But anyways, that's more of a topic for U.S. history. But anyways, for humanities, while we see these impacts on society as well as culturally how it impacts the U.S., let's talk about how it impacts the war impacts artwork. Now, in regards to artwork, America really isn't a premier artistic nation by the time we get to the end of the U.S. Civil War. It won't be until the 20th century that we'll start to see America will really be the center of the art scene. But you do see many prominent artists do emerge out of the Civil War. Now, it wasn't a topic I addressed in great detail, but anyways, as a part of the really war correspondence during the war, I believe it's somewhere in the neighborhood of a few hundred war correspondents would actively, obviously, report on what's happening in the conflict. But you'd also see accompanying them would be a number of artists. One of them would actually be Winslow Homer, who painted this image here that I'm about to talk about here in a second. But anyways, they would go out into the battlefield and they would actually try to actively draw scenes of what's happening in battle and try to capture it for American newspapers and so forth. So even though you do see the rise of photography really during the Civil War, you continue to see that really drawing was still a very powerful medium. Now, looking at Winslow Homer, he was one of those war correspondents that would do this during the Civil War. And then after the war, he's going to become a very well-known American artist. Now, much of his artwork is going to concern maritime, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Maritime imagery. However, images like this one, the veteran in a new field, it's really going to represent themes associated with the Civil War. Now, he paints a couple of Civil War related paintings, but this is the major one I want to look at because it definitely demonstrates how this event has greatly impacted artwork, especially for Americans, in trying to cope with this experience they just went through. Now, as you could probably guess by the title, The Veteran in a New Field, what Homer is alluding to here is really the death associated with the conflict with this veteran returning back home. Now, looking at this image, if you go over here in the front foreground, how we know this is a veteran is you see that this is his Union overcoat as well as his canteen that has been tossed to the side. But he's alluding to the recent conflict because, as we see here, he's using a sheath going through this field, basically cutting down his grain. And what it's supposed to symbolize is almost like this Grim Reaper type imagery of him slashing down not only wheat, but the widespread death where we saw individuals just slash down like grain out on the battlefield during the U.S. Civil War. So we do see the conflict has a tremendous impact on artwork. However, as I mentioned before, we're not going to see a whole lot of artwork, or we will see artwork produced during this period, but it's not going to be anything like what we see developing over in Europe. But an area I do want to touch on to where many Americans are going to be much more familiar with than just mainstream artwork like we saw with Winslow Homer's images are political cartoons. Now, political cartoons would be drawn up by artists, not necessarily Winslow Homer, but individuals like him, like those war correspondents that went out to the battlefield and drew them. But anyways, these political cartoons, they were meant to take complicated topics, specifically political topics, and try to sway individual sentiment in favor of a particular cause. And effectively, they are propaganda for either the Republicans or the Democrats, whoever employs them after the Civil War. And as well as throughout much of American history, I should add as well. Now, political cartoons are nothing new to the years after the Civil War. There's plenty of political cartoons even before it. But anyways, I do wanted to highlight some of these political cartoons just as we talk about Reconstruction, because Reconstruction will become a very tumultuous period as both sides begin to look forward to the future over what should be the legacy of this conflict and what the nation should look like moving forward. Now, this particular political cartoon is really depicting Abraham Lincoln's initial plan for Reconstruction. And it's going to be a critique largely from radical Republicans who, even though they're a part of the same political party as Lincoln, they believe that there should be a very harsh peace adopted towards the South. But anyways, within this political cartoon, what we can see is they're trying to represent to Americans that really the fixing job that the president as well as his vice president are trying to put on the nation is going to be relatively crude. It's not going to hold the nation together, and it eventually fail in the long run. And this was the arguments that radicals were making, because radicals were hoping to bring about a complete social revolution in the South. But anyways, this is more of the artwork that Americans would be much more familiar with during this time period. But anyways, let's talk about Reconstruction, because this will be really where the legacy of the conflict would be established. Now, Reconstruction, if you look at its origins, and I'm not going to go into too much detail just because I talk about it for 3 hours in my 1301 or 1302 classes. But anyways, just kind of in a brief nutshell, an overview of Reconstruction. You could trace its origins back to December of 1863. You could even argue before that, but for the sake of this assessment, we're going to go back to 1863. And in December of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln would release his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, basically looking to the future, trying to establish a process to get the former Southern states to be reintegrated into the Union. He proposes his famed 10% plan, which basically states that if 10% of the white male voting population from 1860 votes to rejoin the Union, then the state would be allowed entrance. Now, it was meant to be a very easy process, quickly integrate the Southern states to avoid a long, protracted guerrilla conflict. And many radical Republicans who want to bring about complete social revolution, who want a more harsh peace applied towards the Southern states, will oppose it, but for the years closing up the Civil War, we'll see that this proclamation would remain in place. And some states like Tennessee and Louisiana would kind of be the testing grounds for some of these policies. But anyways, with the end of the Civil War, the federal government will then begin to put its whole attention behind this idea of Reconstruction, of rebuilding the nation. However, President Abraham Lincoln won't see much of Reconstruction because, as many of you know, on April 14th, 1865, he's going to be shot, assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and thus the question was moving forward, who should control Reconstruction? Now, I do want to go back a few days before his assassination to April 9th, 1865. That's when we see the formal surrender of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee. And throughout April of 1865, we'll see further Confederate armies would begin to surrender. Now, as we enter this period of Reconstruction, the question amongst Northerners and Southerners is, what would the post-war world look like? For many Northerners, they were hopeful that their victory had been absolute. They had utterly defeated the Southern states militarily, and that because of their military defeat, the Southern states would be forced to adopt the new regime. Specifically, the radical Republicans are going to fall in line with this view, believing that they should accept a social revolution. They had been the losers in the war, therefore they should accept the victor's terms. However, Southerners are going to be of a completely different mindset. They believe that the war had resolved the issue over slavery, they believed that slavery was now abolished, but it said nothing of racial equality of what would be promoted by the radical Republicans. And so they will continue to engage in a protracted guerrilla conflict for the better course of the next decade, pushing back against many of the policies of Reconstruction. Now, through the next decade, this protracted guerrilla conflict, it's going to be highlighted largely, as I mentioned before, in opposition to the passage of several laws by the federal government, as well as by state governments, that attempt to bring about a social revolution in the South. Now, in response to this, you'll quickly see white Southerners are going to begin to join organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, White Leagues, as well as a number of other racially charged organizations that would look to inflict racial violence against Northern carpetbaggers, which are Northern Republicans that come south that try to enforce these laws, scalawags, which were white Southerners, individuals kind of like James Longstreet, who was a Confederate general during the war, who fought to defend slavery, but after the war joins the Republican Party and does support the idea of racial equality, at least in a limited scope. And then lastly, they would target African Americans who are looking to assert their newfound rights, that are looking to enjoy their rights to citizenship that are adopted by the 14th Amendment, as well as the rights to their universal right to vote, as is adopted by the 15th Amendment. Well, with this resistance, I mean, really the period of Reconstruction is going to be highlighted by violence. I mean, it's a very chaotic atmosphere. Now, in regards to this violence, it's going to vary from state to state. Now, some states you will see that there would be individual localized conflicts. A couple that come to mind are like Brownlow's War, if you look out in Tennessee, or if you look out in North Carolina, the Kirk Holden War, to where the state governments, largely being governed by the Republicans, are going to employ state guards, local militia, even federal troops to suppress the Klan, White Leagues, and so forth. And this adds to the chaotic atmosphere that we see of the next decade. And as a result, we will eventually see that the hope of Reconstruction, to where we do have true racial equality, like what we see in this image here, to where we see the first African American senators as well as representatives that were really showing the state of racial progress. I mean, there was a lot of hope behind them in changing policies in the United States and living up to that expectation that all men are created equal. However, unfortunately, because of those organizations that I mentioned a moment ago, and because of growing unpopularity with Reconstruction within the North, you eventually see that Reconstruction unfortunately fails to achieve that goal of racial equality. Now, why does I know there's going to be the question, why is there declining sentiment in the North towards Reconstruction? Well, many Northerners, we have to understand, have the same racial views as many Southerners. I mean, we talked about how many Northerners initially did not support the idea of freeing the slaves because they feared competition. And so they still had the same racial stereotypes and racist beliefs that they had before the war. And so many weren't so keen on racial equality. But anyways, Reconstruction would end in a failure by 1877. The military occupation of the South would be lifted, and by then we'd see that it would give in to the Jim Crow era, an era that would be dominated by the Jim Crow laws that would basically strip African Americans of all the rights they had gained during Reconstruction. And to enforce this, we'll see that white Southerners are going to continue to employ not necessarily organizations like the Klan, because that'll be dissolved in around 1872. But they will employ racial violence, lynchings, and so forth to govern their society in order to maintain their racial social hierarchy that we'd seen even before the Civil War. But anyways, with that said, as you do enter the Jim Crow period, I'm not going to go into too much detail just because this is going too much into the history, I think, as opposed to focusing on the humanities. But anyways, you do see that after the end of Reconstruction, Southern society will be at a crossroads. And you'll see that a part of this Jim Crow system, there's also going to be debates over what a new South should look like. And Henry Grady, a prominent writer, would write in 1886 that the new South should not be the same Southern economy that we had seen prior to the Civil War. It shouldn't be solely agriculturally based. It should become economically diverse, and it should develop industry. And this idea does become popular amongst many new generation of Southerners. And it also calls for white and black workers to play a crucial role in this economy. However, through the Jim Crow laws, it's wanting to once again maintain this racial hierarchy that we talked about during the pre-war years as well as the years following. where whites would be able to enjoy much of the success while keeping African Americans really in a subservient status. In the Jim Crow era, the laws that would be passed during this period would remain in effect well into the 1960s. And it's a very ugly history that we see in the United States, but nonetheless, we will you do see this history unfold. And this is something that I'm going to connect more with in the Civil War memory lecture. But you will see it will be because of white Southerners' views and memories on not only Reconstruction, but also on the Civil War to why they will look to enforce and justify the Jim Crow laws. But, anyways, I'll leave it up to that video. But anyways, as we've talked about kind of the historical events that take place after the Civil War, I do want to talk about one theme really quickly. I want to talk about veterans that begin to return home from the Civil War. Kind of what are their views? What are they beginning to do in the days after this conflict? Now, veteranhood after the Civil War, like after many conflicts, is something that you'll see these veterans take great pride in. Many veterans, North and South, were very prideful of the service that they have provided for their respective cause. However, just like individuals in regards to their politics, these individual veterans are going to have different views on the Civil War. Now, many Northern veterans aren't going to give up the idea that they had been fighting to preserve the Union, and to a lesser extent, fighting to end the institution of slavery. But anyways, we'll see that they're going to continue to hold these beliefs, which were in total contrast to Southern soldiers who had fought in the Confederate Army, who had fought to, say, preserve the institution of slavery or maintain life as it had been in antebellum society, and so forth. And because of those two kind of differing views, you will see these veterans are going to clash with one another. But anyways, looking at the soldiers who do become veterans, shortly after their service, they're going to begin to do a number of things. First, they're going to quickly join organizations to really recognize their status as veterans because they're in a very unique class because they're very different than many American civilians. And you'll see that it wasn't long after the conflict to try to carry on that sense of camaraderie that had been promoted by the war that they begin to found a bunch of veteran organizations. Now, there are several different camps that would be established. You'll even see individual regiments are going to hold their own reunions and so forth. But the two major organizations that you'll see Northern and Southern veterans join. If you're a Northern veteran, odds are you will become a member of the Grand Army of the Republic, which we actually see a official souvenir program image advertising one of the encampments around the turn of the century for the Grand Army of the Republic. And then you'd also have the United Confederate Veterans, that would be the kind of more universal organization for Confederate veterans. And they would serve in a number of purposes, everything from commemorating the war, engaging in decoration days. And I want to point out, we're not going to be celebrating it the semester that this video comes out, as this is the fall of 2024. But in the spring, we celebrate Memorial Day at the end of May. Well, the decoration days that these individuals are going to engage in that commemorate the dead, that would be celebrated North and South, that is the foundations for Memorial Day. Some groups by the 1880s will begin to call it Memorial Day and commemorating those dead and the cause that they had fought for during the Civil War. But anyways, it won't formally become Memorial Day until we get to the 20th century. But decoration days were prevalent all across the North and the South amongst a variety of communities, white and black, North and South, so on and so forth. And so we do see that these organizations were crucial in that respect. Also, you would see to a lesser extent some of these veteran organizations would be engaged in trying to provide some sort of assistance for veterans that were struggling to cope with the post-war world. Notably, you'll have veterans that have been maimed from the conflict. Now, it's more so they're going to go to veteran houses for this, but nonetheless, you do see that they would still seek out these organizations for that sense of camaraderie. But anyways, veteranhood, it is a very unique experience, and it means something different for each one of these veterans. But anyways, as a part of the veteranhood, as I mentioned, they wanted to continue to promote that sense of camaraderie. And so no surprise after the war, even before this image that we see here that was produced in 1883, you do start to see that a number of individuals begin to engage in reunions. Now, they would gather at, say, encampments where they would have their particular regiment, or in the case of images like this one, they would engage in a reunion that would take place at a particular battlefield. Now, in this image right here, this is actually a reunion at the Gettysburg Battlefield in 1883, and this was one of the first blue-gray reunions that we see. Now, increasingly by the 1880s, you do start to see the emergence of a reconciliationist movement, and as a part of this reconciliationist movement, Northern and Southern civilians put aside their animosities, but there was also a call for Northern and Southern veterans too. Now, I do want to remind everybody that these individuals, even though they have a common heritage, they have common belief, or I shouldn't say common beliefs, but they have a common kind of background, mythology, and so forth. Many of these veterans, North and South, hold a lot of bitter resentment towards one another for years after the Civil War. I mean, even in the Gettysburg reunion in 1913, which will be the 50th anniversary reunion, you'll actually see that there would be a stabbing between a couple of northern and southern veterans, and it demonstrates to how deep the bitterness and the animosity does does ride. But you do start to see that these blue-gray reunions and the bitter sentiment begins to be laid aside throughout much of the 1880s and the 1890s, as we see in this reunion here. Now, you see a couple of noteworthy Union generals that are listed here: Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, Dan Sickles over here. And in the middle, we have James Longstreet, who was a Confederate general. But anyways, nonetheless, you start to see that these former enemies begin to reconcile with one another after the war, and these reunions become widely popular. However, as we get to the 1890s, still sectional animosity was still prevalent. But really, the singular event that will kind of end the sectional animosity will be the outbreak of the Spanish American War. Now, yes, there had been a number of conflicts, specifically the Indian Wars, that had been waged since the end of the U.S. Civil War. However, there had not been a major conflict that the U.S. had engaged in that would mobilize not necessarily all of American society, but a large portion of American society. But that event does come in 1898. Now, I could talk all about the outbreak of the Spanish American War. It's going to center around ideas of American imperialism. It's going to center around ideas of helping Cuba gain its independence. But anyway, skipping over that, the war promotes a great amount of reconciliationist sentiment. One, because you'll actually see during the war, and propaganda campaigns are actually going to play into this to push forth the reconciliationist movement. As you'll see during the war, there will be a number of Union generals who had fought in the Civil War, as well as Confederate generals who had fought in the Civil War, fighting under the same banner. For example, in the initial invasion force into Cuba, you have William Schaefer, who was a Union officer during the Civil War. He would lead American troops into Cuba, and under his command, you would have General Joseph Wheeler, who had served as a Confederate cavalry officer out in the Western Theater during the Civil War, and now he's serving in the federal service. And there are many other cases like this where you see former Confederates fighting side by side with those they had once fought against. And likewise, you'll also see as a part of the sentiment, as is displayed in this image here, with the older generation, you have the Confederates as well as the Union veterans. Their sons, their son-in-laws, were going off to fight in this conflict. So sons of the South in particular, they were going off fighting under the American banner. And some of them were sons of Confederate veterans. Some of them were sons of Union veterans. And there's actually a book that I'm reading now. Maybe I should grab the book here. But anyways, there's a famous story that comes out of Tennessee to where there was to where there were two or a Confederate officer and a Union officer who had fought against one another during the Civil War. They both saw a son. They're from the same county. They both saw a son that died over in the fighting in Cuba. And so they were weeping together, bearing both of their sons. But it demonstrated how really things had changed over the course of the 30 years and how reconciliation was finally coming into play. They were weeping together. They were now united under one cause. And we see American propaganda really taps into this. We see this with images like this one, which comes from the Puck Republican magazine, and we also see it through images that were produced at the time. In this case, we see Southern and Union soldiers are reconciling while trying to save a young Lady Liberty, or i.e. Cuba, from bondage, as you see here over this chain, breaking that chain from Spain. And so really the war does promote a great amount of reconciliationist sentiment. I do want to point out, while for the most part, many propaganda campaigns are going to promote that American veterans had truly reconciled, Uh, this isn't entirely the case because, as I mentioned with that Gettysburg reunion in 1913, there does still continue to be animosity between these two sides. But increasingly, a part of this reconciliationist movement, they're going to try to ignore kind of what their passions were during the war and start to view the war as almost a major blunder. And it will become a very successful movement, but that's a topic I'll address a little bit more in the Civil War memory lecture. But by the time we get to the end of the 20th century, the impacts of the Civil War were still being felt. Even though both sides were continuing to be reconciled, we still see that the nation was struggling to cope with the legacies of the conflict. It'll impact everything from history to politics to society, and it will continue to impact America even all the way up to our present day. And one of the quotes that I used in the Civil War memory lecture that I'm going to go ahead and quote here comes from the historian Robert Penn Warren, who writes that the only true felt history that America has is the U.S. Civil War. He wrote that in 1961. That was the 100th anniversary celebration of the our 100-year anniversary celebration of the end of the Civil War, but it was also the Civil Rights era. And you could see how Americans were continuing to cope with the legacies and the effects of the Civil War during that period. And even today, we still feel this with the debates over Confederate monuments and the debates still continuing over the issue of civil rights. But, anyways, nonetheless, I mean, the impacts of the U.S. Civil War run deep, not only for those who fought it, but those who live long after it. But anyways, that brings us to the end of our lecture, and hopefully that was a pretty quick one. I'll have to check the video length. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and end on this note. Just like always, make sure that you are reviewing all this week's materials, reading all documents, taking all assignments, as well as watching all videos. But anyways, if you do have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, y'all, go out, be safe, and I'll see everybody in the next video.